It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about soon-to-be Saint Oscar Romero and his book, Saint Oscar Romero, Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, is the author, Father Kerry Walters. Thank you for being here, Father.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Have you seen the movie Romero?
I have, several times.
How accurate would you say that movie, it was, I think it came out in 1989. How accurate would you say that is to the real story of this soon-to-be saint?
That's a great question. Let me preface by saying I love the movie. I think it's fantastic. But like all docudramas, it tends to collapse a lot of events in order to, cram them into a 90-minute feature film.
Sure.
If there's a single aspect of the film that I think is misleading, it's the claim that Romero was a shy, retiring, bookish sort of priest and bishop before the assassination of his friend Rutilio Grande. That just doesn't seem to be the case. Romero was, during his years of ministry in El Salvador, was actually pretty active. He was an introverted man. He was a shy man, but he wasn't bookish. He wasn't withdrawn.
Mm-hmm. How did you first get interested in his story?
I think it was back in the 1970s when I was still in college, and that's the time when a lot of us in the United States were just becoming aware of the troubles in Central America, and especially in El Salvador. So I probably became aware of Oscar Romero shortly after he became Archbishop of San Salvador in 1977. I came to him by way of liberation theology. Now, he certainly wasn't a liberation theologian, but of course he began to be associated with it in the press, at any rate, pretty early on.
I want to get into that and his connection there with liberation theology. But before we do, can you talk a little bit about what was going on in El Salvador at the time and maybe what Archbishop Oscar Romero's involvement with it was?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America. It's about the size of Massachusetts, but it's also one of the most heavily populated. And what that means is that there are a lot of people, landless peasants, campesinos they're called, who manage to survive even today on just a few dollars. In Romero's time, the situation was even worse. About 3% of the population controlled about 90% of the wealth. So there was a huge disparity. When Romero was a student in minor seminary in the early 1930s, a rebellion broke out in El Salvador. It's known as La Matanza, the slaughter, the massacre. And before it was over, 30,000 of these campesinos had been killed by the repressive government that was ruling at the time. And since then, things just got worse and worse and worse. There was one military government after another, each of which favored the landed, wealthy elite, and the situation of the campesinos became graver and graver. Now, Romero wasn't born into a campesino family. He was born into what we might call today a lower middle-class family, but he could not have failed to be aware of the misery and poverty in his native land, even from an early age.
And the subtitle to your book is Pastor, Prophet, Martyr. So can we talk about that first one? What did you learn about his life as a pastor?
Yeah, I was surprised and delighted to learn that by everyone's estimation, regardless of whether they were friendly to Romero or not, he was a great pastor. He was absolutely dedicated to his priestly ministry and involved himself not only in typical parish work and diocesan work, but also serving as chaplain to charity groups, going out in the streets and trying to find shelter for campesinos who were sleeping in the streets. He started a self-help union for shoe-shine boys at one point in his life. He was a wonderful, wonderful pastor. He would work long hours. In fact, one of my favorite stories about him is he was hearing confession after a very, very long day. And apparently he dozed off and gave as the penance for the person who was confessing, said, say 5 pesos. he was just so tired, so exhausted, that he fell asleep and didn't quite know what he was saying. But he was a wonderful, wonderful pastor.
Why would you call him a prophet?
It seems to me that a prophet is an individual who is called by God to relay to the people whom he or she serves what it is that God wants and expects of us. And sometimes prophets can say things that, stick in our craw, and sometimes they can say things that inspire us. And I think that Romero did both of those. I think that Romero really was a man who God had chosen to say some unpleasant truths to people who needed to hear them, but also to communicate great words of hope and reconciliation to people who needed to hear them as well.
And then, obviously, his martyrdom is a little bit more known than these other things, but can you explain what happened at the end of his life?
Yeah, he was Archbishop for about 3 years, and during that time, he became more and more outspoken against the repression and the harsh regime that was controlling El Salvador at the time. By the time he died, there were about 3,000 people a year in El Salvador who were murdered. Now, granted, some of those were kidnapped and murdered by the leftist guerrilla forces that were opposing the military government, but most of the murders and disappearances and tortures were being performed by the government. Romero spoke out loudly and often against that kind of atrocity. His Sunday homilies from the cathedral in San Salvador were broadcast, so they went to the entire nation. He had really quite an influence. And in addition to his homiletic remarks, Romero got into the habit of rehearsing the week's news because the government repressed the bad news and people just wouldn't have heard it otherwise. And all of this increasingly angered the powers that be. And finally, he gave that wonderful and famous homily the night before he was killed at the cathedral, in which he ended the homily by saying words that were just beautifully dramatized in the film Romero that you mentioned earlier, in which he called upon soldiers and members of the National Guard to stop the repression. He said, "I beg you, I command you in the name of God, stop the repression." And that was apparently the tipping point for the National Guard, and he was murdered the next day.
We're talking about Blessed Oscar Romero, soon to be Saint Oscar Romero, with the author of his biography, Saint Oscar Romero, pastor, prophet, and martyr. Joining us is Father Kerry Walters. And you mentioned liberation theology and that he's sometimes associated with this. Can you explain what liberation theology is and why he might be connected to it?
Yeah, liberation theology grew primarily out of a bishops' conference that was held in 1968 in Medellin, Colombia, referred to as the Medellin Conference. And it was a meeting of the Latin American bishops. And in that particular conference, the bishops came to the conclusion that an integral part of preaching the gospel of Christ was to try and empower people with the sense of justice and love that the bishops felt Christ had exemplified in his life. They felt that the church was becoming too top-heavy, but also too removed from the economic and political troubles that were riddling all of Latin America with suffering. And so they defended, for example, the formation of what came to be known as base communities. And a base community is a group of Christians in Latin America, most of whom are lay people, who have been raised up by priests to be preachers of the gospel. And so a typical base community meeting would be one in which campesinos, led by a speaker of the word, as they were sometimes called, another campesino, in reading and discussing a passage from Scripture. Base communities encouraged literacy, looked after the health of campesinos whom they served, and in general brought the gospel down to the masses. A lot of the bishops and a lot of liberation theologians had been influenced by Marxist methodology, and by that they meant, and I mean, an attempt to analyze political structures on the basis of economic and social inequality. And that was what got liberation theology a really bad reputation and a really bad name in more conservative circles. Romero was accused by his enemies frequently of being a liberation theologian. He simply was not. In fact, Gustavo Gutierrez, the father, if you will, of liberation theology, acknowledged this much. What Romero was an advocate of was what he called liberación integral, integral liberation, which actually borrowed from one of his heroes, Paul VI. In 1975, Paul wrote a document, Evangelii Nuntiandi, on the preaching of the gospel, which I would suggest to you really jump-started what we now call the new evangelization. And in that particular document, what Paul suggested is that the church needs to work for the integrated liberation of all people. And by that, Paul and later Romero came to mean liberation of spirit and liberation of body. Liberation from material suffering, but liberation from spiritual suffering as well. In other words, Romero and Paul wanted to liberate the whole person.
Well, and that's interesting because they're both scheduled to be canonized on October 14th together. So was that some kind of strategy from Pope Francis?
You know, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. And I just think it's wonderful that they're both going to be canonized on the same day. There were two people Romero really did admire throughout his life. The first was Pius XI, who had been Pope at least for a couple of years when Romero was studying in Rome at the Gregorian when he was in formation for the priesthood. And the other was Paul VI. After Romero had been named a bishop, he went to Rome to pay the duty, courtesy call to the Pope that a new bishop will. And he was really upset because he was afraid that Paul had heard all kinds of ugly rumors about him coming from his enemies in El Salvador. And he was anxious about how the Pope would respond to him. Mm-hmm. He was so relieved and so delighted when Pope Paul welcomed him, grasped him by both of his hands, and told him not to be afraid. He was the Archbishop. He was the guy in charge.
So how would you hope that people are inspired by his life today, by reading your biography of him?
Well, in the first place, I would hope that they would move from the biography and read Saint Oscar himself. His letters that he wrote while he was Archbishop are just wonderful testaments to his own saintliness. But what I think most inspires people when they learn about Oscar Romero is his courage. Let me put it this way. In the New Testament, particularly in the Acts of the Apostles, the early followers of Christ are described frequently as displaying boldness. The Greek word that's being translated as boldness is parrhesia. And parrhesia is a willingness to publicly express one's convictions for the Lord. And that doesn't seem to be something that strikes us as terribly important these days, perhaps because we've become kind of complacent in our Christianity. But in the context of El Salvador in the 1960s and 70s, it really was a big deal to speak with boldness as we're all called to do. Oscar Romero did precisely that, knowing that the cost for doing so could be grave. And so I think that courage, that boldness, that parrhesia that he displays is part and parcel of the legacy that the apostles have left us and inspires us today as well.
All right. Well, where can we send people to get a copy of the book?
Well, it's going to be in bookstores, but they can also order it from Amazon.com or any other online vendor, or they can order a copy directly from Franciscan Media, my good publishers.
All right. Again, it's called Saint Oscar Romero, Pastor, Prophet, and Martyr. Thank you so much, Father Kerry Walters, for joining us today and inspiring us with a little bit of background on Saint Oscar Romero. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and God bless.